Most people never get a second chance to go back. The decisions made in the early years, the quiet agreements with debt, the silent neglect of generosity, the slow drift away from stewardship, those decisions compound. Not just financially, they compound in character, in relationship, in the kind of legacy a person leaves behind. And by the time the full weight of those choices becomes visible, decades have already passed. The opportunity to start again is still there. But it looks different at 60 than it did at 20. The Bible was never silent about money. It was never ambiguous. Across thousands of years of human history, the same patterns kept appearing, the same warnings, the same consequences, the same quiet invitations to live differently. Scripture addresses money more than almost any other topic, not because God is obsessed with finances, but because he understands what money does to the human heart when it is handled without wisdom. Somewhere between Sunday morning and Monday morning, those truths get filtered through comfort, convenience, and culture. They become optional, softened, and for many people entirely forgotten. This is not a motivational speech wrapped in Scripture. This is not a shortcut or a formula for getting rich. What follows is a collection of 10 principles that have shaped and reshaped lives across generations. Principles that were true before banks existed, before credit scores were invented, before the modern economy was constructed. They do not belong to any single tradition or era. They were written into the fabric of how human beings relate to provision, responsibility, and trust. This is for education and spiritual reflection, not financial advice. If you are watching this and wondering where the years went, if you are standing somewhere between regret and possibility, this was made for you. These truths are not complicated, but they are demanding. They ask something real. They ask for honesty about where you are. They ask for humility about how you got there. And they ask for a willingness to see money not as a reward, not as a measure of your worth, but as a test of your trust. The first truth may be the hardest one to accept. The tithe comes first before you pay anyone else. There is a version of this truth that sounds unreasonable. When the bills are stacked on the counter, when the account is running low, when every instinct says to cover what is urgent first, giving 10% away seems like the worst financial decision a person could make. But that instinct, the one that puts the tithe last, or removes it entirely, has been quietly costing people something far more valuable than money for generations. Malachi 3:10 is one of the most direct financial commands in all of Scripture. God says, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven." It is the only place in the Bible where God openly invites his people to test him. The word tithe comes from the Hebrew mazer, meaning a tenth. This was a foundational covenant practice, not a suggestion buried in ceremonial law. Proverbs 3:9-10 carries the same principle. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing. The tithe is called the first fruits, not the leftovers, not what remains after every other obligation. The ordering matters. Today, the tithe is one of the most negotiated spiritual practices in the modern church. People tithe on the net instead of the gross. They tithe occasionally or only when they feel financially comfortable. Some treat it as optional, something to revisit once life settles down. The problem is that life rarely settles down. The person who waits until they can afford to tithe often waits an entire lifetime. Financial pressure becomes the permanent justification for permanent delay. The tithe is not primarily a financial strategy. It is a posture of the heart. It says, in the clearest possible terms, that God comes before the landlord, before the car payment, before the credit card company. A practical beginning is simply this: before any bill is paid, move the tithe first, even if the amount is small, especially if the amount is small. The habit of honoring God with the first portion is more important than the size of the portion. What you honor first reveals what you actually trust. Debt is bondage. Every dollar borrowed is a chain. Nobody signs a loan thinking about chains. They think about the car, the house, the short-term relief. The paperwork gets signed, the money arrives, and the purchase is made. But something else happens in that moment that rarely gets discussed. A portion of every future paycheck is spoken for before it is earned. A piece of future freedom is exchanged for present convenience. Most people do not feel the weight of that trade until the weight becomes something they can no longer carry. Some Proverbs 22:7. Leaves no room for interpretation. The rich rule over the poor. and the borrower is slave to the lender. The language is not metaphorical. In the ancient Near East, unpaid debt could result in literal servitude. A person who could not repay might be compelled to work off the balance, sometimes for years. The biblical writers understood that financial obligation creates a real transfer of power. Romans 13:8 instructs believers to owe nothing to anyone except the continuing debt to love one another. Debt was never the design. It was a departure from the design. Deuteronomy 28 describes lending freely and not borrowing as a marker of blessing, and the reverse as a marker of consequence. In modern culture, debt has been rebranded as leverage, as strategy, as the way intelligent people build wealth. And while certain forms of debt can serve a purpose, the pattern for most ordinary people is different. Student loans are taken for degrees that may not produce the hoped-for income. Credit cards carry compounding interest and are used for everyday expenses. Buy now, pay later platforms make it easier than ever to spend money that has not yet been earned. Each of these may feel manageable in isolation. Together, they can create a financial paralysis that takes years to untangle. Debt reduction is slow and uncomfortable, but the process itself builds something that borrowing consistently destroys: the discipline of living within your means. A beginning step is to list every debt from smallest to largest and commit to eliminating them one at a time. There is no shortcut, but the person who works through this process often describes it as one of the most clarifying experiences of their financial life. The chains are real, but they can be broken. God owns it all. You are just the manager. The way most people relate to their finances reveals a foundational assumption that what they earn, they own. Their money, their house, their retirement account. Their decision. The idea of personal ownership feels natural. It is reinforced at every level of modern life. But the Bible presents a framework that quietly dismantles that assumption. And when that framework is finally understood, it does not just change how a person manages money. It changes how they carry it through every season of life. Psalm 24:1 states plainly, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Not a portion reserved for religious purposes, everything. Deuteronomy 8:17-18 addresses the human tendency to look at accumulated wealth and credit personal effort alone, and God directly corrects it, reminding his people that it is he who gives the ability to generate wealth in the first place. The biblical role assigned to humanity is not owner, it is steward. A steward manages what belongs to another. Joseph in Egypt is one of the clearest models of stewardship in all of Scripture. Entrusted with authority over Egypt's grain supply, he managed it not for personal gain, but for the preservation of an entire people. The modern distortion is subtle. Many people who consider themselves faithful will give a tithe and pray for provision, while treating every other financial decision as entirely their own. Stewardship gets reduced to a once-a-week percentage. The remaining 90% is spent with little thought about accountability. This pattern tends to show up as lifestyle inflation. Spending rises with income, but generosity does not follow. It also appears as fearful hoarding, accumulating resources well beyond any reasonable need, while real needs go unmet nearby. The shift from ownership to stewardship begins with one honest question. If God reviewed how you managed what he gave you, what would he find? That question is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to produce clarity. Begin with a simple budget review. Not just what you spend, but what your spending pattern reveals about what you actually value. If this principle is reshaping the way you think about money, share your perspective in the comments. A faithful steward does not own the estate, but they are trusted with it. Save during the feast to survive the famine. The hardest time to save is when everything is going well, when income is strong, when expenses are manageable, when opportunity feels abundant. Spending more feels natural. The lifestyle expands, the purchases get larger, and saving, which always felt like a short-term sacrifice, becomes something that gets postponed again and again. But history, biblical history in particular, shows what happens to those who consume everything during seasons of abundance. They arrive at seasons of scarcity with nothing left. Genesis 41 contains one of the most detailed financial strategies in all of Scripture. Pharaoh dreams of 7 fat cows devoured by 7 thin ones, and of 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. Joseph interprets both dreams as a single warning. 7 years of plenty will be followed by 7 years of severe famine. His response was not anxious or reactive. It was methodical. He instructed Egypt to collect a fifth of the harvest during every year of abundance, storing it in cities under careful oversight. Proverbs 21:20 echoes the same wisdom. The wise store up choice food and olive oil, but fools gulp theirs down. The pattern of saving during provision to prepare for scarcity is not incidental in Scripture. It is treated as evidence of wisdom. In modern life, the most common distortion of this principle is lifestyle inflation. As income grows, so does spending, often leaving the same small percentage available for saving regardless of how much is earned. A second pattern is the assumption that present conditions will continue indefinitely. When the economy is strong, the job feels secure, the income seems stable. Saving can feel unnecessary. But economic conditions shift. Health changes. Industries restructure. The person who treats every season as a feast season tends to be the most vulnerable when the famine arrives. The grain strategy does not require perfection. It requires consistency. A beginning step is to automate a set percentage of each paycheck into a separate account before expenses are calculated. Even a small percentage, maintained consistently over time, can shift a person's financial position in ways that are difficult to achieve through any other method. Prepare in the feast, rest in the famine. A generous hand never stays empty for long. Generosity feels counterintuitive when resources feel scarce. The logic of scarcity says, hold what you have, protect what you built, give only when enough is left over. Most people spend their financial lives waiting for that moment, the moment when giving will cost nothing. But that moment rarely comes. And those who wait for it often look back to find they spent a lifetime holding tightly to something that was never truly theirs to keep. Luke 6:38 records. Jesus saying that what is given will be returned, pressed down, shaken together, running over. The image is of a market vendor measuring grain with unusual generosity. Proverbs 11:24-25 captures the same pattern. One person gives freely and gains even more, while another withholds what should be given and moves toward poverty. These are not guarantees of a specific outcome. They are descriptions of a tendency, observed across generations of human experience. 2 Corinthians 9:6-7 reinforces it further. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. In Scripture, generosity is never framed as reckless. It is framed as the posture of someone who understands where provision actually comes from. The modern distortion takes two forms. The first is transactional generosity, giving specifically to receive, treating Scripture like a formula, calculating expected returns on donations. The second is conditional generosity, waiting until financial security is fully established before giving meaningfully. Both miss the core point entirely. Generosity in Scripture is not a reward system. It is a character issue. It reveals what a person actually believes about provision. Someone who genuinely trusts God as their source gives differently than someone who believes they are entirely on their own. The beginning of generous living does not require large amounts. It requires a consistent decision to give intentionally, a set percentage to a specific place kept faithfully over time. That habit reshapes more than the bank account. It reshapes the orientation of the heart. Generosity is not the result of having enough. It is often what produces the sense of enough. If this principle challenges how you think about giving, share your perspective in the comments. An open hand tends to receive far more than a closed one ever could. The love of money corrupts, not money itself. The sentence gets misquoted more than almost any other verse in the Bible. Most people have heard it as money is the root of all evil. But that is not what was written. The distinction matters more than most people realize, because the misquote has produced one of the most persistent and damaging distortions in Christian financial thinking. The idea that money itself is spiritually dangerous, that possessing it is suspect, that wanting financial stability is somehow incompatible with genuine faith. 1 Timothy 6:10 states that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, not money itself, the love of it. Paul, writing to Timothy, was addressing a specific kind of spiritual condition, a hunger for wealth that displaces everything else. The Greek word used is philargyria, meaning a deep affection or fondness for silver. The dangerous element is the obsession with acquiring it, not the thing itself. Ecclesiastes 5:10 reinforces this pattern. Whoever loves money never has enough, and whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. The warning is not about wealth. It is about making wealth the primary object of desire. Jesus stated in Matthew 6:24 that no one can serve both God and money, not because money is inherently evil, but because it can function as a rival god when it is loved too deeply. Two modern distortions appear regularly. The first is prosperity theology, the belief that wealth is a direct sign of God's favor and that more faith produces more money. This turns financial blessing into a spiritual scoreboard. The second is poverty theology, the belief that having little is inherently more holy and that accumulated wealth should be avoided or treated with suspicion. Both frameworks are incomplete. Both tend to produce distorted relationships with money that create harm in different directions. Money is a tool, a powerful one. Like most powerful tools, it reflects the character of the person holding it. A beginning step is an honest audit of how much mental and emotional energy is spent thinking about money, gaining it, protecting it, worrying about it. That internal pattern, not the balance sheet, tends to reveal the true condition of the heart. What money does to the soul depends entirely on what the soul does with money. Wealth built on dishonesty will not last. There is a version of financial success that looks solid from the outside. The numbers are there. The lifestyle is there. The confidence is there. But underneath, the foundation is made of something that cannot hold permanent weight. Decisions made in compromise, the inflated expense report, the unreported income, the contract signed with misleading terms, the trust quietly exploited. Each one feels minor in isolation. Together they construct something that has a way of collapsing at the worst possible moment. Proverbs 13:11 states it plainly. Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. The contrast is deliberate. Wealth gathered through deception tends not to remain. The biblical record consistently supports this pattern. Achan in Joshua 7 took what was forbidden during the conquest of Jericho, a hidden act known to no one at the time. But the consequences were severe and visible to an entire community. Proverbs 20:17 adds that food gained by fraud may taste sweet, but the outcome produces something far more bitter than what was gained. Luke 16:10 presents the foundational principle beneath all of this. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. Faithfulness and deception both scale in the same direction. Two modern patterns appear consistently. The first is everyday financial deception, misrepresenting situations to lenders, underreporting income, padding numbers in small ways that feel inconsequential. These feel minor, but they establish a pattern of compromise that tends to expand over time. The second is systemic accommodation, working within structures that regularly operate dishonestly and gradually adjusting personal standards to match the environment. Both patterns erode character in ways that eventually become visible. Character is built in the small moments before the stakes are high. A practical step is to identify one area of financial life where full honesty is being quietly avoided and bring it into alignment, not to avoid consequences alone, but because the kind of wealth worth building can only stand on ground that will hold. What has honesty, or its absence, taught you about money? Share your experience in the comments. Dishonest wealth is a house built on sand, and the rain eventually comes. Plan your finances or plan to fail. Most financial problems are not the result of earning too little. They are the result of spending without direction. The money was there at some point, but it moved without a map. It disappeared into subscriptions, into impulse purchases, into habits so embedded they became invisible. And by the end of the month, the account was lower than it should have been, and the reason was difficult to identify. A plan does not guarantee a different result, but the absence of one almost always guarantees a familiar one. Proverbs 21:5 is one of the clearest financial statements in all of wisdom literature. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. The Hebrew concept behind the word for plans carries the idea of careful, deliberate thought, the preparation a builder brings before placing a single stone. Luke 14:28-30 records Jesus using the imagery of a builder who counts the cost before starting construction, not to teach architecture, but to illustrate a principle that applies across every area of intentional living. In Nehemiah, the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls was not approached reactively. Nehemiah assessed the damage at Knight formed a plan, assigned specific roles, and executed with discipline. The walls were completed in 52 days. Planning did not create the outcome alone, but it made the outcome possible. Two distortions show up consistently. The first is avoidance, refusing to look at the numbers because the numbers feel discouraging. This allows problems to compound quietly in the dark, growing larger before they are ever acknowledged. The second is over-planning without execution, creating detailed budgets and financial strategies that are assembled carefully and never actually followed. Both patterns keep people in the same position month after month, year after year. Knowledge without application produces no lasting change. A plan does not need to be complex. A simple written budget, income listed, fixed expenses assigned, discretionary spending given a defined limit, is enough to begin. The act of writing it down changes the relationship with money in ways that are difficult to fully explain. What gets measured tends to get managed. The person who refuses to plan is not neutral. They have simply decided that randomness will manage their finances instead. Contentment is the greatest financial strategy. The financial industry runs on dissatisfaction. Every advertisement is engineered around a single premise. What you have is not enough. The car you drive is outdated. The house you own is too small. The vacation you took last year was not the experience you deserved. This is not accidental. Dissatisfaction drives consumption. And consumption, for most people, is what keeps financial progress permanently out of reach. The person who cannot be content with enough will never arrive at enough. Philippians 4:11-12 records Paul writing that he has learned to be content in whatever state he finds himself, whether in need or in abundance. The word learned carries real weight. Contentment is not a natural state. It is a developed discipline. Hebrews 13:5 instructs believers to keep their lives free from the love of money and to be satisfied with what they have, grounding that instruction in a direct promise about God's faithfulness. 1 Timothy 6:6 goes further. Godliness with contentment is described as great gain. The Greek word for contentment is autarkeia, a term used in ancient philosophy to describe self-sufficiency. Paul reframes it as something received through trust in God rather than generated by personal willpower. In a culture of relentless comparison, contentment is not passive resignation. It is an active and deliberate trust that what has been provided is sufficient for this moment. Two patterns appear consistently in modern financial life. The first is lifestyle comparison, measuring personal progress against the visible consumption of others, particularly through social media. This creates a moving target that can never be reached. The second is earned entitlement, the belief that a certain income level automatically justifies a matching level of spending, regardless of what that spending actually costs in the long run. Both patterns share the same root. They define enough by what others have rather than by what has actually been given. Contentment does not mean refusing to grow or plan for the future. It means releasing the anxiety that insists more is always required before life can be fully lived. A beginning step is to identify one area of spending driven primarily by comparison or restlessness and pause it deliberately for a set period. The practice itself tends to be more revealing than the result. If contentment is something you are actively working toward, share what that looks like in the comments. The person who learns contentment has solved a problem that no income level can solve on its own. Leave an inheritance. Think beyond your own lifetime. Most financial planning stops at retirement. The central question being asked is, will there be enough to last until the end? That is a reasonable question, but it is also a small one. It assumes the purpose of accumulated wealth is personal consumption, stretched as far as it will reach. The Bible asks a larger question, not just will you have enough, but what will remain after you are gone? And more importantly, what kind of inheritance will the people who come after you actually receive? Proverbs 13:22 states that a good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children. The scope is intentional, not just the next generation, but the one after. In ancient Israel, inheritance was tied to land, covenant, and family identity. Passing something meaningful to descendants was not optional generosity. It was understood as part of covenant faithfulness. Psalm 112 verses 1-3 describes the household of one who fears God as a place where both wealth and righteousness are present and enduring across generations. 2 Corinthians 12:14 records Paul stating that parents should save for children, not children for parents. The direction of provision matters in Scripture. Biblical generational wealth is not about accumulating status. It is about transferring wisdom, resources, and values in a way that genuinely strengthens what follows. Two distortions appear regularly. The first is consumption-focused retirement planning, spending every available resource on personal comfort while leaving nothing meaningful for those who follow. When this becomes the only goal, it reflects a shortened view of stewardship. The second is leaving financial inheritance without the values to accompany it. Wealth transferred to children who were never taught to manage it responsibly tends to disappear within a generation. The money arrives. The wisdom does not. Legacy planning begins long before the financial instruments are in place. It begins with the conversations that happen at the kitchen table, about money, about work, about generosity, about what things are actually for. A beginning step is to write down what you want the people who follow you to understand about money that you were never taught yourself. That single document may carry more lasting value than any account balance. The truest inheritance a person can leave is not measured in dollars. It is measured in the values that remain long after the dollars are gone. 10 truths, each one simple enough to state in a sentence, each one demanding enough to spend a lifetime practicing. The tithe that comes first is not just a financial decision, it is a declaration of trust. The debt that becomes bondage is not just a number on a statement. It is a slow transfer of freedom that happens one signature at a time. The understanding that God owns it all does not shrink a person's life. It expands it, because the weight of ownership is replaced by the clarity of purpose. Saving in the feast, giving with an open hand, keeping wealth free from the corruption of obsession, building only on what is honest, planning with diligence, resting in contentment, and leaving something worth inheriting. These are not 10 separate strategies. They are one coherent posture. They describe what a person looks like when they actually believe that provision comes from somewhere beyond themselves. None of these principles require a particular income level, a specific season of life, or a clean financial history. They require only a willingness to begin, and to keep beginning, even after the moments when you fall short. The heart is the real subject of every financial principle in Scripture, not the account, not the portfolio, not the debt-to-income ratio. The question beneath all 10 of these truths is the same question: what do you actually trust? Because how a person handles money in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, when the choice is genuinely difficult, when obedience feels costly, that reveals the answer more clearly than any statement of belief ever could. Stewardship is not a department of the Christian life. It is a reflection of the whole of it. A person who has learned to hold money loosely, to give before they feel ready, to plan before they feel capable, and to rest in what has been provided. That person has discovered something that cannot be taken away regardless of what the economy does. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if some topics did not make this list, or there are topics you want us to feature, please leave them in the comments. What is the one truth from this list that you wish someone had told you 40 years sooner?